Hello, thank you for joining me. This time at Bert's Books we are going to be looking at Willi Heinrich's Cross of Iron, or as this edition has it, The Willing Flesh, sometimes translated as The Patient Flesh. I'm going to try this in German. Das geduldige Fleisch. Probably gotten that wildly wrong. Now you may well know the title from having seen Sam Peckinpah's cinematic treatment of it, dated I think 76-77, which is about to, or I believe it actually just has had the lovely steelbook deluxe treatment from StudioCanal. I don't yet have an edition of that. I'll probably pick that up. It is one of those films where, you know, I don't usually like buying the same thing twice, but I may make an exception. And now Peckinpah's film is generally these days widely acknowledged as a classic. It wasn't really received as such at the time of its release. I think it was dismissed as a bit of a duff film, partly maybe because of the spreading reputation of an increasingly dissolute Peckinpah on set, and also the fact that I think at the time war films were falling out of fashion somewhat. You may well be coming to it the way I did, having seen the film first and then subsequently seeking out the novel. Now this was first published in English in 1956. Now the author Willi Heinrich is known as being a genuine Second World War veteran. He was the veteran of a formation known as the Jaegers, which I think is loosely a kind of mountain regiment, if I have that right. Now this story is believed to be loosely based on the exploits of one of Heinrich's comrades during his service, a man by the name of Johann Schwerdtfeger. In fact, the name does pop up in this. I suppose as one of Heinrich's little in-jokes, the name Schwerdtfeger in this has been assigned to another character who's a bit sort of background. He's not one of the prominent characters in it. It was published in the US as Cross of Iron, and once it was known that it was becoming a film, I think subsequent UK editions of the book adopted the film's title. I've only just realised on close inspection this edition is noted as slightly abridged. It took me a little while to think of what's missing, because I have read other editions of this. We'll touch on that maybe a bit later. Anyway, if you are a fan of the film but have yet to read this, you'll recognise a lot in it, but you'll also be struck by a number of notable differences. Now in the early chapters you'll get to meet Steiner and the men of his platoon. You'll recognise a number of familiar names and characters. However, Steiner's relationship with his platoon in the early stages of the book, it's noticeably more gruff than it is in the film, where when you arrive in the film, the kind of condition of affection between him and most of them anyway is already in place. Within the book, that's actually a bit of a process. The only slight exception to that being the character of Corporal Schnurrbart, so named because of the magnificence of his moustache. In fact, we learn from the book that his real name is said to be long forgotten within the operating confines of the regiment. His real name is Karl Riesenauer. However, in general, relationships are a bit more prickly and a bit more complex. There seems to be this tension between Kruger, who's rumoured to be half Russian. In the film, I suppose there's an oblique reference to this with the fact that he's wearing this captured Russian hat, which seems, I don't know how realistic that would have been, but anyway, the character is wonderfully realised by Klaus Laurich within the film. But there's this tension between him and Cairn. Now Cairn is the newcomer. That position in the film is attributed to Dietz, or Baby as he's known in this. He is the youngest, but in fact Cairn is the newcomer. Now in the early stages of the book, Cairn, played in the film by Vadim Glavner, is a little bit of an outsider, partly because of his relative inexperience. Meanwhile Zoll is the unit's resident dodgy bastard. Now, in the early stages of the book, Steiner's platoon are the nominated rear guard when the company are compelled to withdraw to new positions, which are supposedly to be at Krimskaya. However, the swiftness of the Russian advance means they're effectively cut off from the main German force, which themselves are in a precarious position in this post-Stalingrad situation in the Kuban pocket, which has its back to the water. I'll post a map. With Soviet forces clogging up the roads, Steiner's bunch have to slog it through the marshes and the forest in the hope of reaching Krimskaya. Now, as it turns out, the Russians have advanced so swiftly that the new line has ended up west of that city. It's here that Lieutenant Meyer is engaged in a terse discussion with the new battalion commander, Captain Stransky. Stransky is an officer of aristocratic stock who is freshly transferred at his own request from a posting in France. Why would anyone do that? It's quickly apparent that Stransky is a weapons-grade dickhead. He's an arrogant, glory-hunting prick to whom the more seasoned Meyer has taken an instant dislike. It here transpires that due to the abruptness of the withdrawal, other unit commanders had countermanded the regimental instruction to leave a rear guard. It's only Stransky who lacked the experience and the insight to do the same. Now, Meyer informs Stransky that he's confident that Steiner will bring his men out. Stransky hasn't met Steiner at this point. We've already gleaned that Steiner has a formidable reputation as a soldier, but he does have a slightly murky past. There's a business that evidently troubles him of a lost love who died in an accident of some sort. Further to that, he has at some point been busted back down to private from sergeant and even done a spell in a disciplinary unit for misdemeanours unknown. While he's since distinguished himself through actions that have pulled both Meyer and the commanding officer of the regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Brandt, out of the fire, he's so far only worked his way back up to corporal. While Steiner is evidently held in great regard by Meyer, Stransky, without even having met him, takes an instant disliking to him. But in a display of bravado, he rashly promises Meyer that should Steiner succeed in bringing his men back out, he will automatically promote him to Master Sergeant, confident in the supposition that he won't never need to follow through on this. Meyer goes over Stransky's head to inform Lieutenant Colonel Brandt via his aide-de-camp Captain Kiesel that Steiner's platoon were the ones left behind. Kiesel isn't quite as world-weary as his counterpart in the film, played by David Warner, but he does enjoy a very blunt relationship with Lieutenant Colonel Brandt. Kiesel is not afraid to speak his mind to his commanding officer. Brandt cannot technically upbraid Stransky for leaving Steiner's unit behind. After all, he was just obeying an order. He lets it be known that Stransky's lack of initiative in leaving the rearguard is regrettable. Meanwhile, Stransky is busy figuring out his current situation, and he fairly quickly figures out that his adjutant, Lieutenant Treebig, in Stransky's words, prefers the company of men to women in each and every situation. Back out east, Steiner and platoon are engaged in a difficult slog through the forests and the swamps. Being a reconnaissance specialist, Steiner figures out that there's a quicker shortcut which lies through a path and a bridge which is only present on the Russian maps. There's a small settlement at this bridge where a small number of Soviet troops have evidently been posted. Intending to dispatch this flimsy guard force, Steiner and his unit storm into this settlement only to find it eerily quiet. The only noise is a strange animalistic moaning which unsettles the men to such a degree that Cairn loses his nerve and bolts into the woods while Steiner dissolves in a fit of kind of hysterical laughter. The source of this moaning turns out to be a fatally wounded Russian woman soldier whose company attending to her in the dwellings. Steiner makes out that he's willing to execute the whole bunch of them, though within himself he's actually quite uncomfortable with that notion. When a shamefaced Cairn reappears, Steiner is all over him, but Schnurrbart intervenes, telling Steiner to go easy on Cairn on the grounds that Steiner kind of uncharacteristically lost his nerve himself. Steiner doesn't react well to this, and he storms off into the woods with the intention of leaving the rest of the unit to make their own way home. However, some way down the road he realises that he possesses the only copy of the map, so he has second thoughts about this. As he hesitates, he gets into an unexpected brush with a Russian man who'd accompanied the women soldiers. He gives Steiner the slip and vanishes into the wood. Any reason to execute the women is now rendered academic by this man's disappearance, much to Steiner's relief. He returns to the dwellings, where it's gleaned from the Russian officer that the German positions are now further west than Krimskaya. At this point it also transpires that Zoll has been left on his own with the women and has decided to take advantage of this situation in his own rapey fashion. Russian. Caught in the act by Steiner, he's forced at gunpoint into a heavy wooden wardrobe, which Steiner then kicks onto the floor, trapping Zoll. Returning to the other house, he's momentarily transfixed by the dying girl's plight. It's as though she reminds him of the loss of his sweetheart in the years before the war. A solution is arrived at. The platoon will commandeer the Russian uniforms, the equipment and the horses, and they'll leave the women alive to deal with the helpless Zoll however they see fit. Back at the regiment, Stransky is paying a social call to his immediate superior, Major Vogel, who has a bottle of 37 Moselle on hand. Vogel is in the company of Captain Kiesel. Stransky further reveals himself as an arrogant and naively unrealistic knobhead, apparently on a mission, as Kiesel has already put it to Brandt, to achieve spiritual domination over the battalion, not through his rank, but through pure force of personality. As Steiner and platoon trek their way through the woods, Dietz loses control of his horse and has to run into the woods to retrieve it. He unexpectedly runs into a Russian patrol who succeed in putting a couple of bullets into him. Steiner manages to retrieve the stricken private, but once he's back with the others, it's clear that Dietz isn't going to pull through. Dietz expires, an incident further catapulting Steiner back to the loss of his sweetheart, which turns out to have been in a mountaineering accident. As Steiner and platoon approach the limit of the Russian lines, they're able to take advantage of their possession of Russian uniforms, along with Kruger's command of the lingo. They succeed in taking out a forward Soviet communications post, and they put a message through to the trenches, again using Kruger, to expect a patrol through shortly. Steiner elects to push through to the German lines first to negotiate a safe passage for the others to come through. He's confronted by the machine gunner Private Faber, who's naturally suspicious at the appearance of these men in Russian uniforms, and he insists that Steiner sits before the muzzle of his machine gun while the rest of his men come through. Steiner was actually quite impressed by Faber's presence of mind, and he eventually petitions Faber to join his platoon. Now back with his regiment with a Russian prisoner in tow, Steiner is debriefed by Stransky, who now has to make good on his promise to promote Steiner. Steiner immediately displays his prodigious talent for insolence, dumb or otherwise. A mutual non-appreciation society between Stransky and Steiner is quickly established, but Steiner is rapidly summoned off to the regiment for an audience with Brandt and Kiesel, where he learns he's being granted 2 weeks recreation in the Black Sea resort of Gursuf. Steiner is initially somewhat reluctant, but nevertheless he's ordered off to the Crimea, where he quickly displays disruptive tendencies and also displays what might be considered the symptoms of PTSD. There turn out to be a couple of interesting nurses at this resort, one of whom turns out to have been the instrument of Steiner's disciplinary downfall, Gertrude. She'd, for malicious reasons, planted a stolen watch in Steiner's pack and then put the finger on him. Steiner confronts her, forces a written confession out of her, and then perversely tears this to shreds. The other becomes a bit of a romantic interest for the sergeant before he's compelled to head back to the front. Steiner rejoins his company in the Kuban, where we learn that both Anselm and Dawn, aka the Professor, have been lost to a rogue artillery shell in the interim. A friendly staff sergeant, Fetcher, warns Steiner that Triebig and Stransky are showing an unhealthy interest in his background, and that he should take up an offer he's had from Brandt to accept a staff posting a safe distance from Stransky. However, Steiner refuses this. Shortly after this, Steiner foils a Russian attempt to force an assault trench into the company's position. This action doesn't go exactly according to plan, and some rapid on-the-spot improvisation is called for. Corporal Schnurrbart is injured during the process. Stransky and Triebig have kept a cautious distance from all such goings-on, but this doesn't prevent Stransky from upbraiding Steiner for the way he handled this incident. Triebig adds his unasked-for comments, which provoke Steiner to the extent that he takes the rash measure of following Triebig back to his bunker in the dark with the intention of giving him a good pasting. Luck plays into Steiner's hands here as he discovers Triebig in bed with his orderly Private Kepler, safe in the knowledge that neither of them are in a position to speak out about it. Steiner gives Triebig a good thumping. A full-scale Russian offensive is now impending. The storm breaks with an assault on the strategically important Hill 121.4. Steiner sets out to locate an isolated Kruger, and the two are confronted by roving Russian tanks. Although they manage to extricate themselves from this tight situation, Steiner is ordered with malicious intent to lead his platoon back into a counter-offensive. Against all odds, this German counter-attack achieves some success. With minor injuries, Steiner and Hollebach are dispatched back to the rear to the casualty station. They're caught off guard by a roving T-34 in the process. Hollebach is crushed by the tank. Steiner wakes up in a field hospital sometime later. At this time, Steiner is out of action for a matter of months. He learns from regular letters from a recovered Schnurrbart that his company have now been stationed in a relatively quiet part of the sector, which is the town of Novorossiysk. Steiner locates Schnurrbart in a cottage that he's been billeted in with Kruger. Steiner learns here that Lieutenant Meyer was lost in the action on Hill 121.4 and has been replaced by Lieutenant Meyers, who turns out to be Kiesel's brother-in-law. Now, it turns out that Steiner has returned to rather a ticklish situation. In his absence, Stransky has rather over-optimistically put in for an Iron Cross award related to the action on Hill 121.4. In fact, he had nothing to do with it. The first witness to sign the document is Triebig, who of course was nowhere near and wasn't in a position to make such a claim. The second signee should technically have been Lieutenant Meyer. In Meyer's absence, that responsibility now falls to Steiner. Stransky holds his nose and he tries to sweet-talk Steiner into signing this document. However, he's met with the customary attitude. Enraged, Stransky responds by administering disciplinary action, forcing Steiner to dig out his bunker through the night. However, Steiner is called away to regiment by Lieutenant Meyers. Here, Brandt and Kiesel have smelt a rat, and they now grill firstly Triebig and then Steiner on the veracity of Stransky's claim. Perplexingly, Steiner is reluctant to testify against Stransky, and when he's pushed by the colonel, he reacts by being a little bit too forthright, perhaps for his own good. He's ordered to just get out. Captain Kiesel is insightful enough to realise that Steiner considers his disagreement with Stransky a personal matter and that for higher intervention would be a cheap way out. The adjutant is curious why Colonel Brandt has invested so much interest in Steiner. Brandt reveals that Steiner is actually a near-dead ringer for his own son, who died earlier in the war, and in this way Brandt has kind of internalised Steiner as some kind of substitute. However, the colonel now endeavours to no longer intervene on Steiner's behalf and to let matters take their own course. This leaves Steiner as a potentially highly dangerous witness to a cornered Stransky, and when a series of counterattacks are mounted in the besieged town of Novorossiysk in a bluff to disguise the real intention of a rapid German withdrawal.
We are attacking! We are defending! We are counterattacking!
Steiner's platoon is sent on a suicidal mission into an occupied factory from where a Soviet flag hangs provocatively from the tower. Steiner is ordered to rip this down and bring it back for Captain Stransky. This places Steiner's platoon in a highly vulnerable situation where they're compelled to fight their way back through a darkened machine hall, at one end of which a treacherous Triebig awaits in the dark. He knows that Steiner is his ticket out of there and back to France. From here on, the climax of the story is apocalyptically brutal, though still in some ways ambiguous and perhaps surprising, even if you have seen the film. The culmination of this personal vendetta takes place before a backdrop of a fatally cornered unit of the German army attempting a breakout that they know they've very little chance of achieving. Without spelling out the ending of this and giving too much away, you might consider what, if anything, might be a fate worse than death for someone like Captain Stransky. Perhaps the answer to that is humiliation. Now obviously Peckinpah's film did some considerable rewriting and rearranging of this, so it's all the more remarkable the extent to which Peckinpah got the essence and the feel of this story so right. The original title of this, The Willing or Patient Flesh, I've tended to interpret that as relating to the extremities to which men will endure or tolerate for their own reasons or motivations. In Steiner's case, this might be the loss of anything meaningful in his civilian life and his commitment to the men in his care, however much he might waver in this point. Stransky's motivations are of course very different. They're tied up with notions of self-opinion and prestige. This transcends the mere mechanics of rank. Steiner is a social inferior who's punctured Stransky's all-pervading arrogance, and this, even more than the sergeant's threat as a witness, is the basis for the captain's resentment. It's noticeable that none of the main characters in this are particularly committed to the cause of National Socialism. Zoll was Nazified for the purposes of the film. There's no trace of that in this. At one point in the story, the amount of US aid which the Russians are receiving is commented on. One of Steiner's platoon ventures his opinion on the supposed Jewish place in this equation. He's immediately told just to shut up. Heinrich's writing at the forefront. It tends not to be an explicit critique of National Socialism. That seems to be considered a diseased and crumbling edifice that in any of Heinrich's war books isn't likely to last longer than the next 18 months. Rather, it seems to be viewed as this temporary aberration that plays out both as an enabler and a backdrop to the conflicts, both military and personal, that go on within Heinrich's stories. Some of these conflicts, notably that between Steiner and Stransky, are represented as a long-standing historical inequality that existed before Nazism and are likely to persist beyond it. Now, it's also notable that Heinrich's writing, it doesn't take the form of your conventional kind of thriller-minute slam-bang action thriller. In fact, the film ups the pace considerably of that in the book. The pacing within the book itself is far less frantic, with the result that violence, when it does come, is all the more shocking for it. However, there's arguably a slight poetic quality to this work, and there's even philosophical undertones which are particularly apparent in the conversations between Kiesel and Brandt. Much like the film, though, the book is a league above your average blood and guts war pulp. And on that basis, I'd say this book, as well as Heinrich's other war novels that I know of, The Savage Mountain, The Crumbling Fortress, are also worth spending some time with.